The Boardroom Awakening, Corporate Governance and Sustainability. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learnings from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. We move beyond the familiar ESG narrative to confront the challenges of a world where interest in sustainability is waning in some regions, political and economic divides are widening, and technology is reshaping the rules of the game. How can boards maintain momentum on climate and social issues when governments are focused on regulation and public interest is fractured? What will it take for corporate governance to adopt to the trends such as nature and biodiversity loss, AI, shifting global power dynamics, and evolving definitions of fiduciary duties? We'll explore the obstacles facing today's boards and the key trends they must understand to stay resilient and relevant in this uncertain future. So if you are ready for a candid look at the future of governance, let's jump into the Boardroom Awakening. Hello, Frederick. Good to have you. Thank you so much for making time for the Better Boards podcast series.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sabine.
Let's jump straight in. What does sustainability have to do with governance?
Yeah, I guess that's a fair question. We're probably not asking ourselves that very much anymore these days, but we certainly did when it became the big topic. And I would put that around probably 2017, 18, 19, somewhat coinciding with the famous statement of the Business Roundtable in the US, a network of famous CEOs, if you will, that have stated that the purpose of the company is not just to provide profits to shareholders, but to serve all of their stakeholders. And of course, there's another famous person, that is Larry Fink of BlackRock, who published one of his most strongest and one of the first letters urging that good governance also pays considerations to sustainability factors. So all of this sustainability narrative basically translates into stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement as well. And so, as I said, 5, 6, 7 years ago, these various stakeholders, very much driven back then by shareholders, were starting to pressure organizations to set their corporate governance up for better ESG oversight, the famous 3 letters, or sustainability governance, if you will. So pressured by shareholders, by clients, also by employees, by governance, organizations had to take sustainability factors into considerations and make sure that their boards are overseeing those.
Which is interesting. I mean, what I'm observing at board level is that, yes, it is, of course, a topic on a board agenda, and more people have distinctive know-how in the area. But we can't deny that times have changed. And at the moment, it's almost that there is a certain fatigue. And often these issues are almost put into an ideological corner, isn't it?
Yes, of course, I knew that you were taking me down this route. And I appreciate that as well. And of course, you're right. Again, I'll stay with the year 2019. And I believe that the last 5 years have been quite the journey for sustainability. And it was a little bit of a no-brainer just to satisfy all of these various stakeholders to produce disclosures and get the right governance in order and so forth. People have started to look under the hood a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But I think whether or not you like the words, that's not so important really. What is really important is what the underlying issues then really are. So if we're starting to unpack the word sustainability a little bit, what's in sustainability, right? These are climate risks, these are nature risks, human rights risks, technology risks, social risks, geopolitical and geoeconomic risks, and of course, the other side of the coin, opportunities as well. So whether or not you like the word sustainability or ESG, there's still a myriad of risks and opportunities that the board has a fiduciary duty to make sure that they are being paid due consideration And we might just want to change the terminology and the wording on that. So if we are talking about fatigue of, ideological things, of words, of monikers, then that's fair enough. But it does not change the underlying risks and opportunities that organizations have to grapple with every day.
I would like to make it very clear to our readers. I have to ask challenging questions, but I'm not in the corner who thinks it doesn't matter, just to make this very, very transparent. I mean, it is a challenge, let's say. When I look at what we are seeing at board level in the last 12 months, how can directors really make sure that the issue is discussed as you described, as a risk and opportunity topic, rather than that it is sidelined and classified as ideological or a woke issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, the pressure of stakeholders has shifted a little bit. So let's stay with that a little bit for now. 5 years ago, it was just a good thing to do that sounded good in earning calls and that you had to produce disclosure on. And we were seeing all these shiny sustainability reports and board disclosures as well that were very explicit in how the corporation is providing value to all sorts of stakeholders. I think that has definitely changed. If we look at employees, for example, activist employees that were often touted as, taking significant influence in organization, have lost a little bit steam. We've seen this through the massive layoffs in the tech industry. A lot of the functions that were laid off were actually in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And some of that employee activism has died down quite significantly because people were worried about their jobs. And we went from the great resignation of everybody moving on in a very dynamic market to the great stay. People are hanging around, driven by inflation, wanting to make 100% sure that they are drawing a regular salary. So I think employee activism has died down. If we look at regulators now, for example, that's become a geographical question. The SEC climate rule will probably never see the light of the day. And in Europe, we have vast regulations in place now with CSRD, with the CSDDD, the supply chain legislation. And we're seeing many other things in the pipeline. And of course, we have the ISSB standards, and we have the big question about single materiality versus double materiality. So should organizations just worry about the risks to their business, which is financial materiality, or should they also worry about the risk that they pose onto society with their products and services, which is double materiality? Europe is in that corner, and the US is leaning more towards single materiality. So whether or not, again, you share ideology or you worry about nature and climate yourself, you have a regulatory regime in Europe that will force you to put the right business models to a certain extent in case and have the right disclosures and the right board oversight as well. But that also means that if you are an American business wanting to do business in Europe, you are falling under the same regime as well. And this is what we obviously call the Brussels effect, that legislation in Europe often has significant implications to the rest of the world. So from a regulatory perspective, it still remains very much an important topic for boards to stay on top of these things. Now, I won't take you through all of the other stakeholders and what the status quo are of those, but that often changes, of course, as well. And we have now a huge other macroeconomic factors that are influencing the corporate agenda, and with that, the board agenda as well. And we go as far as to say that geopolitical, geoeconomic, and trade considerations, as well as artificial intelligence, are very much part of what you would call sustainability as well, because the implications for society and the risks for organizations and also the opportunities, perhaps not as obvious, are very pronounced and should be part of all of these considerations. To give you an example, climate change is now a significant part of national security's agendas. Obviously, flooding, migration flows, etc., due to unbearable heat and desertification of certain areas that are resulting to national security risk of other countries is a big consideration.
So how can we make sure what you paint there is a very broad picture? How can directors really stay on the top of all of these issues?
So if you think back to the particular context of your organization, first of all, understanding obviously what the material risks and opportunities are. Broadly speaking, if you are a services company or a company that doesn't make stuff, then you probably have less exposure on the environmental side and perhaps some more exposure on the social side. If you are a company that makes stuff, then you probably have exposure in all of the above. So if you have factories around the world, if you have physical assets around the world, then climate and nature implications are very close to home to you because you can't afford flooding, you can't afford power outages, you can't afford any supply chain disruptions that might be affecting, again, your facilities, but also the people that are working for you. So you have that as part of your governance, either in a risk committee, you might have a separate sustainability committee that is specifically concerned with climate and social factors. And of course, then you have to produce your non-financial reporting and your disclosures, which often might sit in the audit committee. So there's a role really for the entire board in the various pillars of what sustainability means to your organization.
And I've seen that more and more organizations cancel almost their sustainability committee because they see it as, at least here in Europe, as something the whole board needs to get involved in. There are so many cross-references. It's hard to put it in one bucket, really.
Well, for the last 5 years, I have regular conversations around the committee question. Should we have a separate committee? And if
Exactly.
not, what committee should it be sitting in? And I know this is not probably the answer that you were hoping for, but the answer here really is it depends, as so often.
Absolutely.
I think if you are a multinational organization, if you have a vast environmental and social risk exposure, then it probably warrants to have a separate committee to have the right conversations. There will certainly be overlaps into other committees. A remuneration committee might have an ESG component imposed in executive compensation and will want to understand how that's designed better. Again, the audit committee, non-financial reporting. So there's definitely an intra-committee exchange that's really important that doesn't often happen. And I'm also an advocate for material decisions being made at the entire board. But it is often good to have a dedicated committee where the work is getting done. Because the risk that you are running if you don't have a dedicated committee, when you are staying with the narrative of the whole board is responsible for it, often it doesn't get enough time in board meetings to really address the issues that the company is facing and the opportunities and have, expert conversations outside of just a boilerplate update. So there is merit of having a separate committee or having it part of another committee that the board already has. But it certainly depends on the context of the organization. And I think tech companies, for example, tend to have that governance sitting in an existing committee rather than having a standalone.
Now, let's do a little bit of an outlook. Throughout the years, there was different emphasis on different sustainability issues. Going forward from here at the end of 2024, what do you think? Where are we going? Which of these sustainability trends do you see?
I have a very concrete answer for you this time because there is very strong data that suggests 3 particular topics, perhaps even 4. And this is research that I've been involved in, service and conversation with boards and with directors and chairs. But there's other institutions as well that have come to the exact same conclusion. Here at Accountability, we certainly have as well. And that's nature and biodiversity loss being a huge risk and an opportunity, such as nature-based solutions, for example. The second, and we can talk a little bit more about this if you like. The second is AI. I mean, AI is affecting the organizations really in at least 3 ways. One is the systematic changes to business models. Is my organization still going to be around in, a couple of weeks or months' time? Is my business model still going to be valid? Or is some AI being developed somewhere that puts us all out of work? Huge social implications that has. The second part of AI is the operations, the data security. That brings us back to cybersecurity, obviously very much a big topic for boards for many years now as well. So how are we using AI internally, and what is the safety of that? And thirdly, what are we putting out in the world that is AI enabled? What products and services? There's already a regulation, the EU AI Act, that is limiting that, and potentially huge ethical considerations to do as well. So very much part of sustainability, if you will.
Okay.
And then the third area is geoeconomics, geopolitics, and trade considerations. And with the recent changes in government in the US and global hostilities growing between countries and a larger fragmentation and going from globalization to a more national agenda, and the flow of trade and people being much more restricted than it was a few years ago, that obviously also has significant implications to your business model, but also comes back to physical considerations of climate change, nature loss, how is this affecting certain assets, and how does nearshoring, friendshoring, which is now obviously something that happens a lot, potentially affecting the inflation rate, because products and services are getting more expensive as you bring your supply chain closer to home in the Western world.
Thank you for that, Frederick. I was just thinking what I'm seeing on the agendas of boards is they're already drowning in the immediate issues, quite often operational issues, yeah, because the challenges are so profound. How do we make sure, how can a director really make sure that they have this long-term view and perspective when there are so many pressures on the current business? This outlook, a lot of these topics have a longer time horizon than some of the more immediate issues. How do we make sure that this balance is there in the board, in the way we divide the time at board meetings, in the time we think about these issues, the brain space of directors? How can we make sure that these issues that have a more longer term implication are really high up on the agenda?
Thanks, Sabine. And I'll give you a snappy answer, and then I will expand a little bit on it. So boards have essentially three jobs, if you will. And this is Jan Babiak I'm quoting here. So first of all, business as usual, BAU, signing off reports, challenging management, selecting the auditors, and things like that, producing the annual report and being perhaps on a capital markets day, what have you. The second job is being reactive, being the last line of defense, is reacting to things that are coming towards the organization in the immediacy, as you mean, advising management how to go about things, perhaps relieving a CEO of his or her duties, if to take a more extreme example, is reacting to whatever happens in the organization, whatever decisions have to be made, whatever capital allocation decisions have to be made, things like that. And the third piece, and I think this is the piece that boards are neglecting the most and that we have to pay attention to, and then that sort of comes back to your question right now, that's being proactive about things. That's doing scenario planning in a contextual environment, not just using climate scenarios and very near-term and probable scenarios, but also going really beyond and thinking about futures that might only be remotely possible. And I recommend, I'm very fond of the Oxford scenario planning approach, or short OSPA, which is very helpful to think about what are the factors that are going to drive the future, not particularly the actors, so not our shareholders, not our employees or clients, but what macroeconomic factors are influencing the future, and what are the future frames that we can ideate. And it's based on plausibility. So how plausible is it that there was only going to be robots working in companies and AI in 15 years' time? It might not be probable, but certainly it is plausible. So how can that inform corporate strategy today? What sort of research project or what working groups can we assign to this today to understand that better, and hence to stay abreast of these potential scenarios? So highly recommend to do more scenario planning, to do it more provocative, and to look as far as possible, and to really think about futures that are only remotely possible.
I mean, you almost answered there my question. Tell us the one thing you have seen a good board is doing in order to accommodate this.
So I think understanding stakeholders is still very important. I think that hasn't changed. We often talk about stakeholder management. So how management engages with stakeholders and how the organization engages with stakeholders. But we don't really talk a lot about stakeholder governance. And my friend Beatriz Araujo, who's the former global head of corporate governance for Baker McKenzie, is very vocal about this, that stakeholder governance needs to be a part of every board meeting. What decisions that we're making is affecting what stakeholder group? And that informs much better as well how we're going to go about these decisions. So good boards and energy companies do that quite well. To give you a little bit of a more concrete example, understand the needs and the impacts of stakeholders. I'll be even more concrete because this is public information. Take Rio Tinto. They had a huge incident in Australia with one of the ancient sites, the Yukon Gorge incident. And based on that, it changed their entire governance and changed a few key roles as well, appointed one of the natives of that particular site where the incident happened to their board, and has drawn up a very good and robust sustainability committee charter as well that points out clearly what the accountability is and how various stakeholders are treated. So good boards have good stakeholder governance. They understand what their stakeholders' needs are and how the organizations impact them. And they sometimes even meet them, even if it is not a typical board thing to do, on retreats or go into the communities, going a little bit of a step beyond the old factory visit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think very good boards have alignment between their strategic intent and their governance documentation as well. Oftentimes, the corporate strategy is not reflected in the board documentation, let alone the sustainability strategy. So it's good documentation. It's being very clear in their charters and rules of procedures, how they go about things.
I can see we could talk for hours about this, but we have to come to a close. And at the end, we traditionally ask one question, which is, what are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
Well, I think I've talked far too much. I think we massively overrun. So I'm sure it was somewhere in what I have said. But yeah, just to summarize, I think aligning the strategic intent between organization management and the board. Removing terminology if you feel you have an eye-rolling moment with colleagues. So remove the word sustainability and remove the word ESG and just think about this as global issues, systemic risks and opportunities, and try to forecast better and spend more time in the future.
Fantastic. Frederick, thank you so much for your fantastic contribution to the Better Boards podcast series.
Thanks so much for having me, Sabine. Thank you.
As always, thank you so much for listening. If you would like to have information about the work we do with boards, please do get in touch. This podcast is our service to the community. What we really do as a business is board evaluations and board developments. If you would like to see a demo of our innovative platform, please do get in touch. If you have any ideas about future topics you would like to see covered, also, please reach out. We are always delighted to hear from you.